παρακολούθησης θα είναι διαθέσιμες σε ηλεκτρονική μορφή στην ιστοσελίδα του Τμήματος Κοινωνικής Θεολογίας και Θρησκεολογίας. Θα είναι λοιπόν διαθέσιμες. Τώρα πολύ σύντομα. Δεν χρειάζεται να τις αναζητήσουμε κάπου αλλού. Η πρώτη μέρα των εργασιών του συνεδρίου ξεκίνησε φυσικά με χαιρετισμούς και προσφωνήσεις από τις εκκλησιαστικές, πολιτικές και πανεπιστημιακές αρχές και πρετανικές αρχές του Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών. Ακολούθησε η πρώτη στρογγυλή τράπεζα με τίτλο «Η Ορθόδοξη Εκκλησία στην Αφρική, έγνοιες και προοπτικές του 21ου αιώνα». Στον κύκλο αυτής της στρογγυλής τράπεζας εξετάστηκαν ζητήματα που αφορούν στον πυρήνα της Ορθόδοξης παρουσίας στην Αφρικανική Ήπειρο σήμερα. Συντονίστρια της πρώτης στρογγυλής τράπεζας ήταν η καθηγήτρια Ειρήνη Χριστινάκη, διευθύντρια επίσης του Εργαστηρίου Κανονικού Δικαίου του Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών, το οποίο συνδιοργανώνει αυτό το πολύ ενδιαφέρον διεθνές συνέδριο. Οι εισηγήσεις ξεκίνησαν με τον Μητροπολίτη Καμερούν, σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη Καμερούν, κύριο Γρηγόριο, ο οποίος ομίλησε με θέμα «Οι προοπτικές του Πατριαρχείου Αλεξανδρίας στην τρίτη χιλιετία». Σκοπός αυτής της παρουσίασης ήταν να δοθεί ένα διάγραμμα των βασικών ζητημάτων που αποσχολούν το παλέφατο Πατριαρχείο Αλεξανδρίας σήμερα και να αναπτύξει ένα όραμα, ίσως και μία στρατηγική για την περαιτέρω πορεία του Πατριαρχείου κατά τον 21ο αιώνα. Οι εισηγήσεις συνεχίστηκαν με την καθηγήτρια κυρία Ειρήνη Χριστινάκη από το Τμήμα Κοινωνικής Θεολογίας και Θρησκεολογίας, η οποία ομίλησε με θέμα το ορθόδοξο άκουσμα στην οικοδόμηση της ειρήνης στην Αφρική. Η ειρήνη, σημείωσε η κυρία Χριστινάκη, είναι θεμελιώδες αγαθό της ζωής, ιδιαίτερα ευάλωτο παγκοσμίως και στην Αφρικανική Ήπειρο. Η Ορθοδοξία σε επίπεδο θεολογίας, δικαίου και διανόησης, όπως αυτά εκφράζονται στο σώμα της καθόλου Εκκλησίας και στις πρωτοβουλίες των κατατόπων Ορθοδόξων Εκκλησιών, συμβάλλει με πολλούς τρόπους στην υπεράσπιση, οικοδόμηση και προστασία του αγαθού της ειρήνης. Η εισήγηση μελέτησε ειδικώς το ορθόδοξο ανάκρουσμα υπέρ της ειρήνης στην πολύπαθη Αφρική, υποδεικνύοντας και μία κατεύθυνση για τον εμπλουτισμό του ηχοτοπίου, της δημόσιας συζήτησης και τον επιστημονικό διάλογο γύρω από το θέμα. Τρίτη εισήγηση στη σειρά ήταν η εισήγηση της διδάκτορος κ. Εύη Βουλγαράκη Πισίνα, μέλος του εργαστηριακού διδακτικού προσωπικού στο Τμήμα Κοινωνικής Θεολογίας και Θρησκεολογίας του Εθνικού και Καποδιστριακού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών. Κυρία Βουλγαράκη ομίλησε με θέμα «Ιστορία, ενότητα και συνοδικότητα στην Αφρική. Μια ιεραποστολική θεώρηση». Η εισήγηση σκιαγράφησε συνοπτικά την ιστορία της Ορθόδοξης Εκκλησίας στην Αφρική και έθεσε ζητήματα ενότητας και συνοδικότητας σε όλα τα επίπεδα λειτουργίας του εκκλησιαστικού σώματος από τη σκοπιά της ιεραποστολικής. Καθώς η αρχαίγονη παράδοση του Πατριαρχείου Αλεξανδρίας συναντά τα κινήματα των λαών στην υποσαχάρια Αφρική και την αναζήτησή τους για μια αυθεντική και απελευθερωτική πίστη, μια εργώδης προσπάθεια λαμβάνει χώρα ώστε οι δύο παραπόταμοι να συμβάλλουν σε ένα πλατή και ήρεμο ποτάμι. Εκεί που σμίγουν τα νερά και υψώνονται οι ελπίδες, η Εκκλησία καλείται σε μια νέα αυτοκατανόηση, σε μια νέα αυτοσυνειδησία, η οποία χρειάζεται να βρει την κατάλληλη έκφρασή της στη ζωή της Εκκλησίας. Παρότι δεν υπάρχουν πάντα πρόσφορες προκατασκευασμένες λύσεις και μια κάποια καινοτομική ευρηματικότητα είναι αναγκαία, η όλη προσπάθεια δεν συνιστά αναζήτηση του νεωτερισμού αφεαυτού, μήτε σημαίνει ότι το στοιχείο της συγχρονίας και παροδικότητας θα υπερσκελίσει αρχαίγονες αρχές και οικείους εκκλησιαστικούς τρόπους. Αντίθετα, η πληρότητα της εκκλησιαστικής παράδοσης και η πιστότητα στο Ευαγγέλιο είναι που μας οδηγούν, σημείωσε και ολοκλήρωσε η κυρία Βουλγαράκη, στη χρήση νέων ασκών για το αήποτε κενό μήνυμα της Ορθόδοξης πίστης. Η πρώτη συνεδρία, η πρώτη στρογγυλή τράπεζα του Διεθνούς Συνεδρίου, ολοκληρώθηκε με εισήγηση της διδάκτορος Άλισον Κολοσόβα, με αντικείμενο την Ιεραποστολική, ερευνήτρια στην εκκλησιαστική ιστορία και επιστημονική συνεργάτηδα στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Ταρτού στην Εστονία. Η κυρία Κολοσόβα ομίλησε με θέμα θεμελιώδη ερωτήματα στο αφρικανικό παράδειγμα από τη σκοπιά της ιεραποστολικής μεθοδολογίας και παράδοσης στο ορθόδοξο πλαίσιο. Η εισήγηση εξερεύνησε κάποιες από τις γενικές ιεραποστολικές αρχές που εισήγαγαν οι εκκλησιαστικοί πατέρες των πρώτων αιώνων, όπως ο Ιωάννης ο Χρυσόστομος και ο Πάπας Γρηγόριος ο Μέγας, στο θέμα της εγκαθίδρυσης της χριστιανικής πίστης ανάμεσα σε λαούς που μόλις πρόσφατα δέχτηκαν το βάπτισμα και του τρόπου της σχέσης με κοσμοθεωρήσεις και πρακτικές άλλων θρησκειών, την ανάπτυξη ηθαγενούς κλήρου και ιεραρχίας, τη χρήση τοπικών γλωσσών στη χριστιανική λατρεία και εκπαίδευση, τη στάση αποδοχής παραδοσιακών πεποιθήσεων, τελετουργικών και τρόπους ζωής και το σημαντικό ρόλο των γυναικών στη χριστιανική διακονία και την Ιεραποστολή. Υποστήριξε η κυρία Κολοσόβα τη θέση ότι ενώ υπάρχει πληθώρα τεκμηρίων πως τέτοιες αρχές εφαρμόζονταν στην πρώιμη Ανατολή, χριστιανική Ανατολή, αυτές οι θεμελιώδες πεποιθήσεις δεν συνέχισαν ως μια αδιάκοπη παράδοση μέχρι τους σύγχρονους καιρούς. Αυτό άλλωστε τεκμέρεται από τον τρόπο με τον οποίο Ορθόδοξοι Ιεραπόστολοι όπως ο Επίσκοπος Ινοκέντιος Βενιαμίνοφ και ο Νικόλαος Ιλμίνσκι, που επιχείρησαν να τις εφαρμόσουν στη Ρωσία του 19ου αιώνα, θεωρήθηκαν ανακαινιστές και συνάντησαν αντίσταση από τους συγχρόνους τους. Η εισήγηση έδωσε παραδείγματα από τα γραπτά τους και τις πρακτικές που εφάρμοσαν, που αναδεικνύουν γιατί θεωρούνται πρότυπα αυθεντικής ορθόδοξης ιεραποστολικής πράξης από σύγχρονους ιεραποστολολόγους όπως ο Αρχιεπίσκοπος Αλβανίας Αναστάσιος και ο πατήρ Μιχαήλ Ολέξα. Αφού εν συντομία εκφράστηκαν κάποιοι συλλογισμοί για το πώς και γιατί οι χριστιανικές εκκλησίες έχουν δυσκολία να εφαρμόσουν την αρχή του εμπολιτισμού που συνάδει με μια θεολογία σαρκούμενη, κατέληξε η κυρία Κολοσόβα θέτοντας ερωτήματα για το βαθμό στον οποίο ένας τέτοιος εμπολιτισμός λαμβάνει σήμερα χώρα στην Ορθόδοξη Εκκλησία στην Αφρική. This was an introductory note regarding all the events and the main points of the first day of our international conference. This, therefore, was a panorama of the first day. Now, today, we will have our second roundtable, second session. Dr. Alison Kolosova is presiding over this second roundtable. She's very welcome. She is with us now. Thank you very much, Dr. Kolosova, again, for the honor. And in some minutes, I think, we will be able to begin. Now, let's take our time, our last minutes, last breaths, so as to be able to attend this conference with ease and effectively. Ας πάρουμε λίγο το χρόνο μας, κάποιες τελευταίες αναπνοές, κάποιες τελευταίες δοκιμές σε όλες και όλους. Όσες και όσοι επιθυμούν τη βεβαίωση χορήγησης παρακολούθησης μπορούν να γράψουν τα ονόματά τους στο chat της εφαρμογής. Μπορούν αυτό να τα γράψουν. Δεν είναι προαιρετική βεβαίωση χορήγηση, μόνο όσες και όσοι το επιθυμούν. Και σημειώνουμε πάντοτε ότι οι βεβαιώσεις θα αναρτηθούν σε ηλεκτρονική μορφή, στην ιστοσελίδα του Τμήματος Θεολογίας. Δεν χρειάζεται να αναμένετε να τις λάβετε προσωπικά. Εκεί θα βρίσκονται σε πολύ εύχρηστη εκδοχή που μπορείτε να τις κατεβάσετε όσοι και όλοι. Πολύ σύντομα θα είμαστε έτοιμοι να ξεκινήσουμε. Όσες και όσοι έχουν ερωτήσεις, if you have any questions, if you wish to address any question relevant, of course, to the keynote speeches of the second roundtable, you are very welcome to do so by writing them on the chat, on the Zoom chat, if you are watching us through the Zoom platform. So let me repeat, if you wish to address any question relevant to the keynote speeches of the forthcoming of the second roundtable, you are very welcome to do so by writing them on the chat of our Zoom environment. Yes, Dr. Kolosova, the floor is with you. We may begin.
Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to welcome everyone again to the second day of this conference, African Soundscapes, from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in Greece. We had a very exciting start to the conference yesterday, which raised some of the very crucial questions which are facing the Orthodox Church and particularly the Patriarchate of Alexandria in Africa currently. And the beginning of the conference very much had a note of kind of honesty and reality and trying to face the situation on the ground. In this second session, we will be hearing from not only representatives of the other Christian churches, but also one paper about the Orthodox Church in Nubia. But the general emphasis will be on the general presence of the Christian churches in Africa, and particularly in modern times. And we have some extremely eminent representatives of the scholarly communities, both Protestant and Catholic. We are delighted to welcome them today. Our first speaker is Professor Emma Wildwood. She's a professor in African religions and world Christianity at the University of Edinburgh. And she's a co-director of the Centre for the Study of World Christianity in Edinburgh. She's the author and editor of several books and many, many articles, and has particularly researched the life and ministry of Apollo Kivabulaya, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. We're very delighted to welcome you, Emma. And Emma's topic is Protestant missions and African Christians from the 1790s to the 1960s. And as our overall moderator has just explained, you can put questions both in the chat whilst Emma is speaking, if you have questions, although we will have our general discussion and questions at the very end of the session. Okay, so thank you very much, Emma. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Alison, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. Apologies for my background. I'm not in a cupboard somewhere. I'm actually in an office, but I'm just moving in. So you don't see my books, you see my boxes. It's really good to join with you today. And I understand that the paper, a very kind of draft paper, has already been circulated. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it is, yes.
Okay, so I'm imagining that most people have got sight of the paper, so I'll probably take us through it quickly. I've got a few slides just so that we can keep up with names and that kind of thing. And if I can just share my screen here, you'll be able to see them.
Very
okay.
well, very well, very well.
Thank you. I've chosen this period because it explains some important foundations, we could say both good and bad and indifferent, to Christianity in Africa today. And I've just put up some statistics here because what I'm doing is really, these are foundations, because although these statistics are in some ways contested, I think they give us a good indication of Christian growth, and I'm including the entire church here, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal. But we see that in 1900, there was only about 8 or 9% of people were saying that they were Christian in Africa. And this leaps up to 38% after independence, and it becomes 49% in 2020. So in many ways, Christianity on the African continent is a post-colonial religion in terms of its numbers. And yet a lot of foundations were laid in this early time. So I'm going to go through very briefly a kind of chronology. It's quite selective because of our time. And I'm going to look at 3 themes: Christian societies, translation and civilization. I hope you'll see why I've put those together. And then just talking about this move into independence in the kind of 1950s into the 1960s. And of course, countries like Angola and Mozambique don't gain their independence until the 1970s. I was hoping to carry on sharing my slides and not my notes, but let me see if I can move this across. Can you still see those? I hope so.
Yes, we can still see your slides. Your first slide we can see.
Great, thank you. So what I think is important to understand is this relationship between the abolitionist movement and Protestant Christianity. It is not a straightforward relationship, but when the first Christian missionaries arrived on the African continent, they were connected with the West African coast slave trade. There were very few of them.
Professor Weil, pardon me for a moment. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a sequence problem with the slides, so I will present them for you, and when you wish to, you tell me to change the sequence.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. So we should be on early actors.
Yes, 1 minute, it's all right. And you were on slide number 2.
Okay, could you change to slide number 3, please?
Of course.
I mean, they're very simple. It was just a way of...
Now it's all clear. It's all clear.
Okay, I can still see slide number 2.
Yeah, it needs to be the next slide.
Yes, I am on slide number 3.
Yeah, and the next one, please.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
lovely.
That's right.
Thank you. So I've included their names here, and all these men who trained in Europe were in some ways connected with the slave trade, and yet they were relatively small. They were on the coast, and there was quite a sea change, if you like, by the late 18th century, where we have prominent abolitionists, some of them quite well known, William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, others less well known, Hannah More, Oluda Equiano and Ottobah Cuguiano, began to say that slavery was abhorrent, slave trade was abhorrent, and that it was unchristian in broad brush. And they, over a number of decades, they fought for the end of the British slave trade. and they set up a settlement in Freetown in now Sierra Leone, which welcomed emancipated enslaved people from the Americas who returned to the African continent, and it welcomed recaptives. So British naval forces were patrolling the seas, and where they found slave ships, they took them over and brought recaptives. Of course, there was still a lot of slavery going on, but this was the start of something. And I think what's key for us is that the Protestant churches in Europe become increasingly abolitionist through the missionary movement. The missionary movement is abolitionist at heart, and it propounds this message of a gospel that liberates, that frees people. This isn't a political gospel particularly, but it does have political ramifications in this era. And perhaps we could move on to the next slide. We also saw a number of other movements here. I've put down on this slide that we have Moravians, Methodists, the Great Awakenings, the Evangelical Revival. These are all feeding in to some very early missionary societies: the Baptist Missionary Society, London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society. You see, this is very British focused at this point, but then we have the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in 1810. We have the Basel Missionary Society established in 1815, and the Paris Evangelical Missionary Society in 1822. And those early Moravians are feeding into this North Atlantic Anglophone at first revival. And there's lots of connections across the European continent as well. And so we see these are volunteer societies. They're not connected and to a particular they're not part of the formation of a particular church. Obviously, the Church Missionary Society is an Anglican missionary society. The Baptist, as it says, is Baptist, but they were set up on volunteer principles, not by the central church. Then we see central churches beginning to have their own mission boards, and that changes a little bit the dynamics of the institution. By the end of the 19th century, we're seeing a different form of missions again. I've put some names down here: Sudan Interior Mission, African Inland Mission, and Sudan United Mission. These are what we often refer to as faith missions. So they are a lot more diffuse in their organization. They pray for their support, and they often missionaries often go out in the faith that the support will follow them. And over time, they have to develop a more kind of robust institution behind them. But they start off with this model of individuals asking their networks for support in order to run their mission activity. And they're often looking, these faith missions are often looking for places where they there hasn't been Protestant missionary activity before. And there is a kind of low level, what we might call ecumenism or organization, where Protestant missions get together and try and make sure they're not all in the same area. And this is something that particularly comes out of the Edinburgh 1910 missionary conference, which happened just a few yards away from where I'm sitting. So there is some interaction, but there's also concern by these missions that the old established missions are too much interested in modernity. And I think this is an important point that I'll come to in a minute. So there are different theological opinions, and there are also different ways that impacts on the ground that I'll talk about. Pentecostal missions get started from very, very early on. We see waves of Pentecostal revival in that first decade of the 20th century. Often people look at Azusa Street in the United States, but we see these revivals across the globe. And we see the first Pentecostal missions arriving in South Africa about 1908, similar timeline for West Africa. And again, they're based on this faith mission principle. They spread very quickly, and they challenge some of the racial segregation, particularly in South Africa. So in the early years, we see black and white Christians meeting together, and that remains a hope, but it is not always realized as politics intrudes and people's own kind of suspicion of the other intrudes. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to, I put this slide up and I'm going to mention some of my themes now, but here are some of the names that may come through. What we see is that both Protestant theologies and ways of being church influenced missionary views, but also immediate contingencies. And one of the questions that Africans who became Christians asked is they wanted to know how to live as Christian people. And most missionaries had an ideal of how individual transformation through conversion might work in community and wider society. So largely Protestant missions were influenced by the evangelical revival, were expecting individuals to convert first, but they expected this to transform the community and wider society. And the interesting thing is here is they expected this to look a bit like their best, what they could imagine European society was. So there's a lot of work on how imperial ideals were circulating at this time. We need to understand most Protestant missionaries as being quite critical of their own cultures and very critical of the cultures they went to visit. They were this sense that their Christian faith had to be perfected, had to be worked out, made them very critical of the cultures that they lived in. You'll understand that there's quite a lot of theology behind that I'm kind of glossing over. But nevertheless, missionaries often had an ideal view of European society, what European society would look like if everybody were evangelical Christians. And they kind of brought that to the African continent. But whilst Protestant notions of individual conversion challenge social expectations around communal well-being, they also challenged expectations around engagement with the natural world and gendered behaviour. And what we see is that African Protestants began refashioning their society along modern lines, and sometimes they adopted a suspicion of local art, music, and stories that maintained connections with their pre-Christian life. And I mentioned John Colenso, the Bishop of Natal, because he was quite unusual in defending a kind of limited continuation of the practice of polyandry, of having a man having more than one wife. This was almost universally condemned by missionaries as not being proper Christian practice. Female circumcision was also condemned, and I've just seen Esther Mumbo on the call, and she's written a very interesting paper on women who in the early 20th century join the East African revival because they didn't want to be second wives, and they were inspired to leave their husbands at some considerable cost. I've also talked about Mary Slessor, who is a well-known missionary from Scotland. She, with the United Presbyterian Mission, was very critical of a number of practices, particularly the killing of twins at birth and the killing of the enslaved and wives of very rich and influential men at their funerals. And yet she is also very interested in particular forms of culture, and she actually supports some of the sort of marriage practices as being acceptable. So during her time, she kind of changes some of her views, understands the situation much better. And so these ideas of how to live a Christian society have a very evangelical approach, and yet they're working out on the ground what this might look like on the African continent. I've mentioned translation as one of my themes. This is particularly important for Protestants. They devised grammars, they translated the Gospels, in some cases the entire Bible. Mission presses produced Christian literature, and they also collections of proverbs, histories, newspapers, and journals on current affairs. I've mentioned Samuel Ajay Crowther, who led the translation work into Yoruba, which is a people group in Nigeria and Benin. He was one of these recaptives who grew up in Freetown and returned in 1843 as a missionary among his own people. And a generation later, James Holy Johnson, also from Freetown, began to move on from simply translating the Bible and translating prayers and hymns into particular languages, but began to think about how diverse languages and cultures could coexist by holding to a common sacred text that was translated, that began to think about African philosophies and African theology. He was involved in discussions, Pan-African discussions about raising up the culture and societies of Africa as European imperialism began to bite. And he also had discussions with traditional diviners and incorporated Yoruba religious names into Christian baptismal rituals. So from a straightforward translation model, we begin to see what we've often called an enculturation model. How does Christianity become at home? How is it domesticated, if you like, on the African continent in different African societies? But this was always rubbing up against Protestant missionaries who were still convinced that Western culture, because it was Christian, and that's the key point, represented the pinnacle of civilization. And we see Protestant missionaries assuming that proper African Christian leadership would replicate what they considered civilized ways of thinking, organizing, and dressing. And so they're expecting that. And you see, to a certain extent, people like Samuel Ajay Crowther becoming these very erudite, well-educated, civilized gentlemen. And yet we see a sea change in Protestant missionaries who no longer support the older civilizing mission approach, who see that, this import of European dress is worldly and ostentatious. And so these missionaries, and they come in with the faith missions, but the kind of holiness piety of the late 19th century Protestantism, which in Britain is often called Keswick holiness, has this really strict ethic of personal morality. And they want to see Africans as kind of spiritual rather than modern, if you like. There's a number of CMS missionaries who, through a number of events, publicly humiliate Crowther, who has been bishop for some 30 years, and really pull down his authority in the area where he was bishop. And they do so through these kind of theological ideas, through these expectations of spirituality, but these are infused now with a kind of soft social Darwinism that is expecting, on the one hand, a particular high expectations of African Christians, but assuming on the other that they're not going to reach those high expectations. I'm rushing on now to talk a little bit about independence. It's important to know that in Protestant Christian circles, there was a lot of discussion about independence from Protestant churches, and that led into conversations about independence from colonial authorities. I've mentioned Edward Blyden, who was born in the Caribbean, who went to the newly independent Liberia in 1950, and who was an advocate of political and religious independence, a movement known as Ethiopianism. It's both inspired by biblical references to Ethiopia and also to the ancient Christian kingdom, and also to the fact that in the modern era, Ethiopia had resisted colonial intrusion. And so Blyden works quite hard in West Africa to inculcate these ideas, and he writes, and you can find his essays if you're interested. And so he's encouraging religious independence. So Methodists, Baptists, and Anglicans all form their own churches so that they have their own autonomy. They often look quite similar. And then in the early 20th century, we see African independent churches, or African initiated churches, as we tend to call them, to lump them all together, where worship and practice, whilst begins to take on what has often been called a more African flavour, in the sense of the ways in which it uses music and artefacts. And yet the African leaders of these churches are often quite clear that they are doing something different from indigenous religious practices, but they're perhaps borrowing some of those patterns of worship. And this is so we see independent churches developing as we come up to the independence era, but many of these traditional Protestant churches are still working on the African continent in the 1960s, and they are still that the missionaries are reluctant to give this control over to African peoples by and large. There are some exceptions to that rule, but there's still this sense of a sort of protective, paternalistic sense of control. And it takes perhaps men like John Gatu of the Presbyterian Church of Kenya in the 1970s to really provoke international mission organizations to think about their role and to be challenged to say that African leaders can take control of their own churches. They are able to rule, and that it has been a kind of superiority complex of European missionaries to assume otherwise. I see the time is running on, so I'll stop there, but I hope that's been helpful.
Yes, thank you, Emma. That was a wonderful overview in a very short period of time, but you managed to include so many of the vital points that need communicating. And I think particularly to many of us of Orthodox background, it's particularly helpful to have such an overview. And thank you for being both kind of critical and positive. I think I liked very much your positive side. I think we often hear the kind of criticism of the Protestant missions, particularly in the 19th century in the colonial era. But thank you for pointing out many of the positive things, which I think have a direct influence later on the emergence of orthodoxy in sub-Saharan Africa. But we'll discuss that more later. Thank you very much. Now, I'm just trying to see whether, is Sister Mary Joan with us? Yes, hello. Yes. Hello, Sister Mary Joan. Yes, it's lovely to see you again. Yes. Thank you. Hello, Sister Mary Joan.
Hello.
Yes, our next speaker will be Sister Mary Joan, who I'm delighted to introduce to you. I met her earlier this year, and we had some wonderful conversations and time together. Sister Mary Joan, I think is speaking to us from Nairobi. Is that right, Sister Mary Joan?
Yes, from Nairobi.
Okay, yes, Sister Mary Joan is speaking to us from Nairobi. She's a member of the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Mother of Christ, in Nigeria, as far as I can gather, which is why I was asking you whether you're in Kenya now. And she's also Vice President of the International Association of Catholic Missiologists, and she teaches missiology in various different educational institutions in Kenya, as well as being involved in the formation of her sisters in Nigeria. She will be speaking to us now about the Catholic presence in Africa, and we hope that she will particularly give us the perspective of a woman in Africa and of her teaching of missiology in Africa. So we welcome you, Sister Mary Joan. Lovely to see you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. In the first place, I would like to thank Alison and Eve for inviting me, particularly Alison, to talk on an assessment of the Catholic presence in Africa, a woman's viewpoint. I have a lot of things, but then because of time, I will try to pick out some important points that might help us to understand this topic. First, I begin with the introduction, and after the introduction, we look at other things. Africa is the second largest continent compared to other continents in the world, and this gives Africa an edge in the Christian world. According to P. Jackins, the places where Christianity is spreading and mutating are also places where the population levels are rising quickly. So for him, this will continue to rise throughout the next century. In fact, Christianity in Africa is growing very rapidly. Nowhere else do the future prospects for Christianity look so promising. This is a fact from the assessment of religious institutions, theologians, sociologists, and commentators on Africa. Jackson assessed that the focus of Christianity is graciously shifting to the South, that's Africa and the Latin America. He believes Europe and North America are all but unaware of what is one of the most shifts of the present century. The explosive growth of Christianity in the Southern Hemisphere is great. Again, for him, the Americans and Europeans are blind to Christianity's real future, and the move will never shift back. D. Wyndham, one of the experts, is also that Africa is one of the most fertile areas for the Roman Catholic Church. According to the Pew Research Center, Africa has the world's third largest Catholic population after the Americans and Europe. Nearly 1 out of every 5 Africans is Catholic. The center expects the number of African Christians south of the Sahara, including Catholics, to double by 2050. In addition, the visits of the pontiffs by Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Emeritus, and Francis are signs of the Vatican's commitment to the African continent. The popes believe and appreciate the Catholic presence in African continent. Today, the Catholic Church in Africa is in full swing, a missionary sending church in the 21st century. The church sends African Catholic missionaries to spread the good news to other parts of the world. In the same vein, Catholic women in Africa today have seen themselves as part and parcel of the church. They have contributed greatly to the growth of the Catholic Church in Africa that is built upon the great heritage gained from earlier foundations of Christianity. Catholic women have the qualities the church needs, especially the Catholic Church. According to Pope St. Paul VI, in his message to women at the closing of the Vatican II, said the following: at this moment, when the human race is undergoing so deep a transformation, women impregnated with the spirit of the gospel can do so much to help humankind from falling. In our contemporary world today, this message is still relevant and important. So I have other points, but I think the best thing for me is just to direct to the last point that really deals with a woman or woman's viewpoints. I name it as assessment and impact of Catholic presence in Africa, a woman's view. The Catholic presence in Africa cannot be described as anything short of amazing. Catholicity is growing faster in Africa than in any region in the world as already. Africa has the world's third largest Catholic population. Canaries assess that the balance of power, at least in terms of numbers, if not yet in place, is drastically shifting towards the global south, and what some scholars now call not the third world, but the majority world. African birth rates, unlike most of their northern Christian counterparts, continue to rise. There will, for instance, be more people in Nigeria than in the US in a few decades, and Nigeria is less than 10% of their size in square meters, in square miles. For Canaries, in 1900, there were less than 2 million Catholics in Africa, a significant portion of whom were white missionaries and European bishops. But today, the story has changed with the drastic growth of the Catholic presence in Africa. In fact, according to the data from the Vatican, approximately 20% of Catholics live in Africa. The church, moreover, stated a growth rate of 2.1% in 2020 on the continent. The growth was influenced in a way by a new impetus and strategy employed by two new missionary congregations founded in France, explicitly for mission in Africa. These missionary congregations were Congregation of the Holy Ghost by Francis Lepperman, formerly known as Puritans. Then in 1854, Malcolm the Marian Brasilak founded the Society of African Missions, which together with Holy Ghost fathers shared responsibilities for the West and East Coast of Africa. These French missionary societies played a very important role in the revival of the Roman Catholic presence in Africa in the 19th century. Then later in the 1860s, another two new missionary societies were founded precisely for mission in Africa. So we have the Verona Fathers, founded on 1st June 1867 by Daniel Comboni. They had their principal field of work on the Upper Nile. Though in 1864, Daniel Comboni attempted to revive the work of evangelization with his new plan for the regeneration of Africa by Africans. Today, the presence of the Catholic Church in Africa has contributed a lot, both in the entire Christendom and society. It has a great influence in the social sectors of education, health, politics, formation of consciences, of the culture of peace. It is worth noting that the Catholic Church in Africa is a very lively and spirited church with a lot of parishes in many dioceses. No wonder it embraces a large percentage of the global Catholic population. Indeed, the Catholic presence in Africa, together with missionary work of the early missionaries, were the seed from which the African women and entire generations of convinced Christians germinated. The missionaries' vision and action have contributed greatly to making Catholic presence in Africa a church capable of enriching the whole universal church with its gifts. The writer of this paper is convinced of this with her humble experience and the testimony as an African woman, religious missionary in the early 90s in East Africa. Inspired by the Christian mandates of evangelization according to St. Matthew 28:19 and the catechism of her congregation, the young tender religious with joy accepted her posting to be a missionary. The writer, myself, a Nigerian nun of the Congregation of the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Mother of Christ, that immediately after her first religious profession on 28 June 1981 in Nigeria, was sent to Kenya as a young missionary in a very remote area of Kakoi in Egeyo Madakwet, an outstation of Mumbo Parish in Eldoret Diocese. Till date, Kakoi is still an outstation of Mumbo Parish. Thank God, today Kakoi can boast of electricity. In those ancient good days, there were no electricity, no clean water, no good or accessible roads. Only one matter to pick up was in existence. Working with Kakoi children as a classroom teacher then in 1981 was a joyful experience. I found joy in their innocence, their timid way of life, and at the same time, their desire to explore or discover new areas of action or activity. Her deep association, as myself, with them made me to believe without any doubt that the religious women are the mothers of the children for as they are in our care. There is that strong relationship of love and mutual trust which is created, leading to success in our apostolate, especially in education for them. And for us, immense joy. In fact, through my entire apostolate endeavors, especially in Capcoy, as always, I discover in the people the deep need to be listened to, understood, supported, and encouraged. I also observed a deep spiritual hunger for spiritual things, hunger for knowledge of God, the triune God, hunger for love, truth, and justice. Consequently, women religious share greatly in the mission of the Catholic Church, especially in Africa. Women religious enrich the church through their witness of life, and they work as theologians, teachers, spiritual guides, and the professionals in many ways. Though sometimes their service and contribution to the mission of the church are not always recognized and valued. For us, the mission of sharing of Jesus to others is the fundamental and essential element of our religious vocation. The women religious feel that with their call, they cannot just keep to themselves the experience of Jesus. It is meant for everyone. The apostolic exhortation, Verbum Domini, rightly states, the word of God has bestowed upon us the divine life, which transfigures the face of the earth, making all things new. His word engages us not only as heralds of divine revelation, but also as its heralds. God's word engages them not only as heralds, but also as heralds. These they demonstrate in their mission through their different apostolates. Thus, among others, they share in the mission of the church through the following: witness of life, education, healthcare, charitable and social works. So let me go further. So I don't want to go in depth of these works. I know eventually we are going to get the papers.
Yes,
so
yes, I think Sister Mary Joan, perhaps just a couple of more minutes as we have.
Yes.
Yeah, lovely, thank you.
So in recent times, African women religious unwavering have commitment to social works, and there are some of them that have been mentioned and have been given awards. Like we have Sister Rose Mystica, a Ugandan, received a Guinness Power of Goodness Award in 2000 for her courageous service and outstanding work with vulnerable children and needy women affected by war and HIV/AIDS in Uganda. Then we have Sister Beatrice, a Malawian sister, received in 2010 $1 million Opus Prize Humanitarian Award for her engagement with Malawian orphans. Then we have other sisters too, and the ladies. Recently, the La Cruz Africa has identified some of the most outstanding 10-day women and religious women who have imparted the church in Africa in 2021. We have Sister Joseph Ndalula, we have Duamara, we have Sister Veronica Okwenibo, and the others. Then we have the Catholic Women Organization who are also doing very well in their different capacities in the family, church, and the society. They have continued to reflect on their role as Catholic women in the family, church, and the nation. And this has eventually led to the establishment of the functional Catholic Women Organization Association for better organization of both spiritual and temporal well fed. They work in different places. They have that apostolate of presence, assisting church institutions in reconciliation ministry. Then the next one is the Synods of African Bishops and Catholic Women. They have now recognized the worth of women in the church. So it is equally important to acknowledge the Synods of African Bishops for their commendations for the involvement of women, particularly the Synod of Bishops, Rome, 1994, recognized and accepted that women in Africa are the backbone of church society today. Likewise, Pope Francis, we want to say later something about Pope Francis and the women in the life of the Catholic Church. Generally, women have potential, and most of them are genius. We have qualities that the church needs. So today, Catholic women applaud Pope Francis' recent move to recognize and uphold the worth of women in the church by appointing women to senior positions in the Roman Curia. He challenges the local church to follow the example. It gladdens the heart of Catholic women that Pope Francis is determined to open up new positions of responsibility for women in the Roman Curia. On 13th July 2022, Pope Francis appointed 3 women to the Vatican office that selects bishops as members of the dicastery for bishops. This is the first time that women have been given such role in the Roman Catholic Church. 22 surprise to Catholic women in Africa. Pope Francis on Thursday, September 29, 2022, gave a surprise gift to Catholic women in Africa by appointing one of us, Sister Adelaide Felicitas Ndilu, a Kenyan by birth, the daughter of African soil, as one of the 10 new consultors to the dicastery for communication. She is a member of my religious institute, Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Mother of Christ. She is also the current National Executive Secretary of the Commission for Social Communication for the Kenyan Conference of Catholic Bishops and Director of Radio Wamini in Nairobi. Recently, in the month of July, these are dynamic, and Sister Mary Adelaide was also appointed as a board member.
Sister Mary Joan, could you just quickly conclude? We would love to hear more, but I'm afraid we have other speakers. It's fascinating to listen to you. Can you just finally conclude in a couple of sentences?
Okay. Yeah, conclusion. It has been shown that Christianity has been present in Africa visually since its inception, and that Catholic presence is fast growing with a lot of potential. Today, the presence of the Catholic Church in Africa has contributed a lot, both the entire Christendom and society. Catholic women share prominently in the mission of the Catholic Church in Africa. They enrich the church through their witness of life and work as theologians, teachers, spiritual guides, and professionals in many ways. They play a great and important role in the formation and the advance of Christianity in Africa and across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Mary Joan. I think we could listen to you for a long time more. It would be so interesting. Thank you so much, particularly for sharing your own personal experience and the experiences of the sisters of your community and the extremely important work so many of them are doing. It's wonderful to hear. I hope we can hear a little bit more at the end. We shall pass on to our next speaker now, who I'm pretty sure is with us. This is Professor Esther Mumbo, who has also been particularly interested and involved in raising issues connected with women and their ministry and women's lives. Is Professor Mumbo with us? Yes. Yes. Okay.
1 minute to locate him. He may. Chair may open her microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Esther Mumbo. And in fact, as far as I'm aware, she's connected
with us, of course, yes. And now is it on the spotlight?
Okay.
Very pleased to have her with us today.
Yes. Can I just introduce Professor Esther Mumbo, who is also a Kenyan African theologian, and she teaches church history and theology, particularly from women's perspectives. She's a professor of theology at St. Paul's University in Limuru in Kenya. And she's a graduate of the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World, which is the institute which today Emma is one of the directors of. So we have a direct link there. Anyway, I won't say more because we'd like to hear from Professor Esther. Thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to what you have to say. Just be aware that this session is supposed to end at 12 o'clock, and we still have 2 more speakers after yourself. So please try to be brief. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just mute me when my 10 minutes are over.
Okay, I think you can have perhaps more like 15 minutes, but yes, thank you.
So thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much to the speakers that have gone before me. We seem to be very, very connected. Thank you so much, Emma, and for what you had to say this morning, and Sister Mary Jones. I was asked to talk about women and church, and I can only talk about Protestant women and the church in terms of the things that I do and in terms of what I've been able to study and what I teach. So women in African Christianities, as I call it, have been a backbone of the church, as Sister Mary has rightly observed. The work of women still remains in archives and in people's hearts. A lot has not been brought to light in terms of writing. And today I talk about two groups. That is one that began before independence and one in the post-independent period. And that is first the women that are known as the women of uniform, and then the second one, women of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. Then I'll say something about theological education and women in preparation for leadership of the church. In modern times, when women have been studied, people go back to the 16th century and mention the story of Donna Kimpa Vinte, who, having joined the Christian community through the Portuguese Catholic missionaries, was enlightened and was able to see and challenge what she saw then as racism and paternalism that was mitigated on the Africans and particularly women. And through her reading and her conversion, she noted that as a woman, she could be free to also start communities, and later started the St. Anthony's. But she never lived long, but was banned at stake because it was seen as teaching the wrong message, but seeking liberation and doesn't get it at the time. But when one looks at the missionary period, the modern missionary period, we do find, as Emma has noted earlier, the terms of missionaries coming to Africa, and particularly Protestant missionaries coming to Africa, and very concerned about the place and role of women in Africa. And their perception of the role and place of women in Africa, particularly from the traditional society or the African society, they saw the women as victims of traditional practices of food taboos, initiation rites, marriage and funeral rites. Work that has been done by Modupe, who observes that women were victims of these practices. So mission work among women during that time was work to liberate women from what was seen as oppression. And women were important because they were viewed as those that would help the growth of the church. And in one part in Western Kenya, when a boys' school had been started and boys were being taken to school, the men asked why there are no women's schools, because where would they get educated women like them? As a result, girls' schools were also founded, and these girls' schools were, of course, to train these women to become wives of the educated or the civilized at the time. And so the teaching of many women during the missionary period was teaching about motherhood, which was about childcare. It was about feeding methods. Many of the earlier women who joined the mission stations and were schooled were prepared to be the leaders of society at the time as supporters of their husbands. In my own works in Western Kenya, looking at the Quakers, you see how many girls come to the mission station. They are trained, and they are trained about home care and how they end up supporting the community church through this work. What the mission work did for the women then was to create very strong women's organizations in the mainland churches and later even in the African independent or instituted churches, organizations that have become the backbone of the churches. Most of these groups named in different ways, like the Society of Quaker Women, the Mothers Union in the Anglican Church, the Methodist Women, the Dorcas organization in the Seventh Day. In many of the Protestant and even Catholic spaces, you have these strong women's organizations. Most of these women groups continue to provide spiritual and moral support for the women. And these women find a way of exercising their freedom to minister to one another, to explore scriptures together, as both Nyambura and Isabel Piri have noted. Though limited in their hermeneutical critique of patriarchy, for instance, they remain a source of strength for many women in these denominations. These groups are also a source of financial support for the churches through fundraising activities. And many of the churches would not survive if these women were not there. So credit to the missionary organizations that prepared women in this way to give them a space within the churches and places where they have acted and continue to act strongly. There is a lot to be written about these women's groups and the support they gave the church and they continue to give. In the Presbyterian Church, for example, the Women's Guild was at the forefront in terms of talking about women's leadership as elders, women's study of theology, and women's ordination. This year, the Presbyterian Church celebrated 40 years of women's ordination, and the story is traced back to how these women groups were instrumental in ensuring that women had another role other than just being in the background or doing social work for the church. After the independence, both political independence and religious independence, when churches became churches rather than mission organization, there were questions about the place and role of women in the churches other than being in the society or in the group. And what you find that in the 70s, churches begin to talk about the ordination of women. A significant space where that discussion took place was in the ecumenical circles. So a place like the All Africa Conference of Churches provided the space where women could speak freely, questioning ways in which they can lead other than just being members of the groups. The All African Conference of Churches, founded in 1963, worked towards the strengthening and growth of the African church and gave room for women to discuss. And so we do find that the growth of women's organizations, other than just the societies like Mothers Union, are increasingly coming to the fore. In the 80s, we do find that there have been more women educated, and some of them have done a bit of theological education. And we have a leader in the name of Professor Mercy Amba Oduyoye, who in her earlier days begins to see that there are many women in the churches, but there are fewer women in the leadership of the church. Something that I later write about, that women in the pews and men in the pulpit. So Mercy Amba Oduyoye, who worked within the ecumenical movement, begins to look for sisters who are educated theologically and who can continue the leadership or going into the leadership of the churches as lay and also as ordained. We know that in 1988, there's a declaration by the World Council of Churches, a decade of churches in solidarity with women. And talking about it, Mercy Oduyoye notes that it was a space for women to find solidarity with one another. And it was aimed at helping the women to question some of the oppressive structures within the church community and to affirm them as leaders as well, especially those that had attained education in different forums, but also in theological education. The decade was very welcome with the African churches, and it was one that the churches celebrated as they continued to see how best the women could be encouraged and to study. So in 1989, therefore, Mercy Oduyoye with a few sisters forms what is called the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians in Ghana, an organization that was both intercontinental and also interfaith, because she argued that Africa doesn't have only Christians, Africa has different religions. The aim of this organization was to empower women, lay and ordained, to study and write theology, which would impact the churches. She noted that in the theological forums, there was very little written by women from women's perspectives to influence the trainees and also the leadership of the church. But as Mercy observes, that theology is not something you receive in a package. Theology is something that you struggle with. The members of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians began writing theology, locating it in the experiences of women. Other than arguing about abstract ideas about theology, it was how do women experience God, how do women read the text, and how do women practice theology. So several areas became important for the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians to write theology. Two of them were a focus on culture and a focus on gender, and using the two as frameworks of writing theology. In terms of culture, the members of the Circle of Concerned African Theologians ensured that it was to look at culture objectively, look at that which affirms life from African culture and challenge or critique that which destroys life in African culture. Secondly, the women went for a restored focus of studying the Bible. And as Musimbi Kanyoro observes, the women noted that the Bible is quoted in many spaces, socio-political, economic. And for women, the Bible is used both as a tool of liberation and a tool of oppression. And she said, this should be read and read from women's perspectives so that the voices of women are lifted and it is used more for the liberation rather than oppression. The women also focused on issues around gender-based violence, writing about gender-based violence, bringing to light the violence experiences both in the family, in the society, and even within the sacred spaces, the church. In writing about gender-based violence, women also took up the writings on pandemics. And for about 10 years, 10 or 15 years, the women discussed HIV as a pandemic and all the issues that came out of HIV as a pandemic. And thirdly, the women took on the interfaith issues within the continent. How do the different religious faiths relate to each other? The Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians was 30 years in 2019. So for 3 decades, women have written theology that is now read in most parts of the world. The theme that has been undertaken again critically is the theme of the environment, writing about Mother Earth and Mother Africa and how environmental degradation has affected the people, but affected the women at large. So through research and writing, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians have brought to the fore what it means to do theology in context and some of the frameworks that have to be used for writing theology. The publications cover a wide range of topics, but looks at basically the experiences of being a theologian, of being a lay person in the church, and of leading the church. The publications show how women articulate lived theologies in Africa, because theology is not something that we receive in a package, but theology is something that we struggle with in a particular context. The writings, of course, have been exemplified by the original writings of people like Mercy Oduyoye, who affirms that a method of writing should be narrative, the storytelling as a way of writing, asserting that African women accept story as a source of theology and so tell stories as well as studying the experiences of women and other women in the context of the church.
Esther, I'm sorry.
In conclusion,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In conclusion, just to say that the women in uniform of the church, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, are an example of ways of being church in the continent and a growing church. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Esther. You've poured so much into the very short time we've unfortunately been able to give you, but thank you so much for this fascinating summary of what you've told us, and particularly hearing about this, the Circle of African Women Theologians. This is just so crucial, I think, particularly for us in the Orthodox churches, where the issue of women in the church is being particularly raised and discussed in Africa. So thank you so much. We shall move now quickly on to Professor Garasimos Makris, who is from the Pantheon University in Athens. And rather than being online, he's actually in the conference hall, which is wonderful. He shall be taking us to a particular area of Africa, to Nubia, and discussing the issue of Greek Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa on the basis of the metropolis of Nubia. So thank you very much, Professor Makris.
Thank you very much. It's kind of weird to be live in a conference, but nonetheless, I would like to thank the university and especially Evi Bulgaraki for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a nice story for reasons which will become apparent, hopefully, in the end. It has to do with the Orthodox metropolis of Nubia, which is based in Khartoum in Sudan. And it is related, the story, the history of this particular church, of this particular seat, is associated with the history and the fate of the local Greek community. So we can trace the presence of Greeks in Sudan back in the 19th century, but it was mainly after Sudan became more or less a British colony in 1898, let's say 900, okay, that the Greek population really emerged and it comprised a community. The first thing that the Greeks did back in 1900 was to raise a church that was before having a legal entity as a community or even a school. So for the Greeks at that time, the church was very important. The Church of Annunciation, that is the building, was consecrated in 1910 by the Patriarch of Alexandria, and in 1918, the seat of the metropolis of Nubia was created. And it was created under Metropolitan Nikolaos, who in 1935, he became a Patriarch of Alexandria. Now, in 1931, the Synod of Bishops elected as Metropolitan of Nubia Arsenios Kakoyannis, who held the office until 1940. I'm going to give you a few dates first, just to understand what we're talking about. But the problem was that he visited Khartoum only rarely, that he stayed more in Alexandria. Then, from 1947 to 1957, the seat of the metropolis of Nubia remained vacant, but there were two very able priests at the time, during that decade, who actually operated, let us say, the church. Now, Synesius became Metropolitan of Nubia just after a year Sudan got its independence, 1956. So the first 7 years of Synesius, during the independence of Sudan, ironically perhaps, were the best years for the metropolis. That was not because of any sort of Christian and missionary reason, but mainly because the Greek community was a thriving community. So it had to do with the community rather than with anything else. Things did not develop well, though. The most important developments were the outbreak of a civil war between the Arab-Muslim Northern Sudan and the African Christian, and let us say, it's a bad term, but let us say animist Southern Sudan, a war which after, there was a short pause in the 1970s, but really the war ended, believe it or not, in 2005, which is yesterday, okay? Now, the economy collapsed, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. We had 3 military coups, 58, 69, and 89. I was there during the coup of 89, and the hated Islamist dictatorship came down only in 2019. That was 30 years later. Now, 30 years later is a generation later. So we have a generation of Sudanese who didn't know anything but an Islamist dictatorship. During this long period, the Greek community, which had started with 120 people in 1900, it went up to 6,000 to 8,000 people in the 60s was reduced in size, and today there are no more than 10 to 15 Greeks in Sudan. There are, though, more Greeks which are half Greek and half Sudanese, that is, they are of mixed parentage, okay? And unfortunately, nobody really knows how many of them are there. And this is mainly because, unfortunately, again, nobody really cares about them, okay? Now, the metropolis, in a sense, was what a social scientist would call, together with a school, an ideological mechanism of the community, because it was the mechanism that caters for baptisms, for marriages, and for funerals. Greeks did go to the church every Sunday in the 60s and in the 70s, but not to great numbers. And then the number of people who participated in the liturgy dropped down dramatically. In a sense, the church functioned throughout all these long periods as a kind of Greek cultural institution. So it was first a Greek institution, then an Orthodox institution, and lastly, a Christian institution. It sounds very bad, but unfortunately, I think that that was the case. However, at the same time, we have to be fair. Sudan was not and is not an easy place for Christians, especially northern Sudan. It has been governed by Islamists. I personally am a great friend of Islam, but I'm an enemy of Islamism, especially in its dictatorial forms. So there was never, ever a way for the church to participate in some sort of missionary activity in the north. There was some missionary activity in the south, but again, that was not very much pronounced. Not only for political reasons, though. It was mainly because the Greek settlers, both in the north and in the south, saw their church as a Greek institution, as an institution that was not supposed to reach out to non-Greeks. I'm an anthropologist. I'm saying stories. So I'll tell you a very short story, an incident that shows you exactly what we are talking about. In 1997, 7 Black children appeared in Khartoum, coming from southern Sudan. The children were of Greek descent, but had been baptized Catholic because there had been no Orthodox priests around in South Sudan at the time. That was not an error on the side of the church, but it was because of the war. So they came to Khartoum because the South had been totally devastated. Now, the Greekness of these children, who were the children of Black Greeks, was, quote unquote, proved legally when the Metropolitan, the then Metropolitan, discovered the birth certificates of their fathers, which mentioned their names of their Greek fathers, that is, the grandfathers of their 7 black children. The whole matter was arranged on sufferance, and it was impossible to prove the legality of the marital unions which had produced the 7 children. What was at stake was the Greekness of the children, and from the perspective of 1997, the continuation of the Greek presence in Sudan. Because as the Greeks were moving out from Sudan, suddenly 7 young members became the new blood in this community, okay? At the time, I should remind us, the school had 11 students. In the 1960s, there were 700 students, okay? So the children were baptized Orthodox in 1998, and the whole affair was supported by the entire Greek community. This is a wonderful story. Unfortunately, this is only the first part. Now we come to the second part, because in 1998, after the baptism of the 7 children, another 20 black children emerged from the south, and they came to the north for similar reasons. And again, of course, the Metropolitan discovered the birth certificates of their fathers and grandfathers and declared them Greek and baptized them in the Greek Orthodox Church and enrolled them in the Greek school. But this time, the Metropolitan found himself against the majority of Greeks, of the settlers, the few settlers who had remained in Khartoum, because for a very simple reason. They did not dispute the Greekness of the children on legal grounds. They denied it on cultural grounds. They were saying that these young children may be legally the sons or perhaps the grandsons of Greeks, but they don't speak Greek. They know nothing about Greece. They don't know anything about Greek history, etc., etc. So in a sense, in the eyes of the community, the young children were not Greeks. So the first thing that we have to remember now is that Greekness meant different things for the church and different things for the community. There was, though, another more practical reason behind the fear of the settlers and their reluctance to accept these young children as Greeks. Because the presence of such little black Greeks in their midst could lead the by then withering community to a strikingly different future. You see, the Greek community owns the plot where the church is, the plot where the school is, the plot of the Greek community, etc., etc. And all this is in central Khartoum. It's like having a huge compound here in Athens in Syntagma Square. Okay? So it is very valuable. Who is going to work to own this piece of land when there are no Greek settlers around anymore? That was the question. So suddenly, the emergence of black Greeks baptized by the Greek Orthodox Church created a kind of problem for the community. Now, in 2000, things turned even worse. Why? Because the Metropolitan was murdered. I'm not going to go into the details of this Saudi affair because it's sort of, anyway, it's strange. The whole incident poisoned the community because, in a sense, it was connected with these children and some of the relatives of these children who had come from the south. In 2001, Bishop Kallinikos, who was the Dean and Patriarchal Church Warden in Cairo, was enthroned as the new bishop, as the new Metropolitan of Nubia. A very nice man, I've met him, but he did not speak Arabic and his English was rather poor. So Kallinikos viewed his post with apprehension, and in 2006, he submitted his resignation. In 2006, a new Metropolitan was enthroned, Emmanuel, who was a relatively younger man. He was a very able bishop. He had seen long service in Ethiopia and Egypt, and he tried to enlist the help of the remaining settlers of the community. However, the settlers were not positively inclined towards helping the church. We are talking about a very bad situation where we don't really have anymore a living community. And because of this, we do not have, or from the point of view of the settlers, of the few settlers who were there was no point, in a sense, to have a functioning metropolis. There were no baptisms, there were no weddings. So the church was there only for Christmas and Easter celebrations, which were always muted because of the Islamist dictatorship. Okay? And also for the celebration of the 25th of March, the 28th perhaps of October, this kind of things. Now, an interesting development was that a few years back, the day of the liturgy changed from Sunday, which is a typical working day in Sudan, to Friday, which is a day of rest in Muslim societies. The reason, the reason behind it was to attract more people. It didn't. The reason why it didn't is debatable. As an anthropologist, I'm telling you what the people say. So the around 15, 20 settlers who were there at the time, Greek settlers, were telling me that Friday morning is the only week morning we have with our families to go and drink coffee all together, or to have breakfast, etc., etc. And we don't want to go to the church. It would have been far better if we have done it like the Catholics do it in the afternoon or even in the evening. Okay? Now, it didn't happen. So in a sense, the church was always either locked, or there were very few people inside who more or less, not all of them, but more or less, were half Sudanese, half Greek. Two of the cantors of the church today are two ladies, half Sudanese, half Greek. The one is a doctor in Khartoum, and the other one is a dentist in Khartoum. They do not have Greek passports because nobody cared about them.
Sorry, Professor Makris, could you just draw your conclusions? Sorry to have to interrupt you.
The last sentence is not very nice, but I have to say it because it was something that the settlers told me about the church. It is not something that I espouse or even perhaps I agree with, but it is part of what I've been taught, that on the whole, during all these years, the Patriarchate of Alexandria sent to Khartoum people who knew nothing about Sudan, who didn't care about the country itself. So in a sense, there were people who could have been very nice in character, very able theologians, but they were totally isolated from anything else in the country. So when the Greek community that somehow supported them disappeared, the whole edifice crumbled down. And also I was told that the people who were sent to Khartoum, they were sent as a kind of, let us say, they were not promoted by being sent to Khartoum. It was a kind of, depreciation, yes, depreciation. Somehow they had to do penance in Khartoum for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then they would take a better post. Unfortunately, I did not speak to you about missions, but I spoke to you about a church that was vibrant, but due to political situation and to cultural setting, it did not manage really to flourish. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Makris, for this very sobering paper and for raising a very vital issue, I think not only for the Greek Church, but for all the Orthodox Church, the entire Orthodox Church. As we have very little time left, we shall move now to Father Professor Jean-Luc Enyegu. I think, can I just check that he's here with us?
Yes.
Yes, hello. I'm very glad to introduce to you Professor Jean-Luc Enyegu. He takes us back to Nairobi, Kenya, as far as I'm aware. Is that right? Are you speaking to us from Nairobi?
I usually work in Nairobi, but I'm now in Mumbo, in Chad.
Okay, thank you for letting us know. Professor Enyegu is the director of the Jesuit Historical Institute in Africa, and he's a lecturer in history at the Hekima College, Nairobi. He's published this year, as far as I'm aware, a book, Competing Catholicisms, the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the Making of Post-Colonial French Africa. And this issue of competing Catholicisms is the main theme of the paper he's going to read to us now. Okay, thank you very much for being with us. I'm sorry that we're not giving you that much time, but I think if we can give you 15 to 20 minutes for your paper.
That will be fine. Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you for inviting me and for the great panel we had this morning. I am visiting small villages in Chad right now, so my internet connection might not be that stable. If I can share my screen with you. Okay, can you see it?
Yes. If you would like to try to change 1 or 2 slides to be absolutely sure.
Okay, yes. Like this? Like this?
Yes, go to one. Yes, Perfect. Professor, it's perfect. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. So basically, I will be sharing with you the kind of lessons I think we can draw from my latest book, Competing Catholicism, as far as the relationship between the Catholic Church and other churches is concerned. I just want to invite you to have a few seconds looking at this image here. That's the book cover. And I wrote here that everything is in the eyes. In the eyes. This is the 6th station of the cross by Angelbergen, which is part of Hekima College Chapel. And in this 6th station of the cross, we have Jesus here and Veronica here, who is really trying to do a very good thing by wiping Jesus' face with this piece of cloth here, in which is printed Jesus' own face and in one single cross. But when you look at the eyes, they seem rather defiant. We don't see a lot of compassion there. We don't see a lot of love there in something that is actually beautiful and meant to be good. Now, as I was reflecting, I faced 3 sets of challenges. The first is that I recently read an article by Andrew Love, Eastern Orthodox and Ecumenism, some reflections. And at one point, he talks of the Catholic Church hierarchical nature, and even argues that even in the 20th century ressourcement movement and its appeal to collegiality, the Catholic Church has basically kind of failed to live through this collegiality, because it remains rooted in the sacramentality of the episcopate, in isolation from the rest of the priesthood and the fullness of the faithful. So the first challenge is the Catholic Church is hierarchical or patriarchal, as we just heard. So how can it still appeal to ecumenical dialogue today? The second point, and I think the two are related, is that once the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church is acknowledged, once its patriarchalism is acknowledged and its many historical sins confessed, was it not preferable, one person asked, to look at religion, including the history of the Catholic Church in terms of revelation and revolution, able to challenge the institutional history of a male-dominated order like the Jesuit, which I was actually studying. So the point behind here is that why then study institutional history of an all-male religious organization belonging to a hierarchical and patriarchal church like the Catholic Church, instead of promoting more democratic and revolutionary approach to history, or social history, one might say. And the third challenge has to do with a quotation in Lord's article, in which he quotes the liberal theologians, including von Harnack, who believe that theosis is characteristic of Greek Christian thought, in opposition to Latin theology characterized by the doctrine of justification. And later on, the Lord acknowledges that, I quote, Harnack's banful Hellenization of Christianity became Florovsky's heroic Christianization of Hellenism. That's the connection. So when we talk, for example, of Africanization of the church after independence, do we talk about the Christianization of Africanity or the Africanization of Christianity? And that issue will dominate some conversations in Roman Catholicism following Vatican II. So 3 challenges: hierarchy and patriarchy, but also revolutions and revelation, and the issue of Africanization. Is it a form of Christianization of Africanity or Africanization of Christianity? Now, why do institutional history? That's what competing Catholicism is trying to do. The main focus of competing Catholicism is institutional history of the Jesuit, a global and diverse order in its own right. The choice of institutional history is justified by the fragmentation of African societies. One might even say the deteriorization of African societies within the global community, and the ever-splitting nature of non-Catholic Christian dominations, effectively coined by David Barrett as schism and renewal. That's the reality of most African churches. Now, what I say here in red is that African politics, and you just heard it from the experience of Sudan, are not lacking revolutions and the disruption they bring. Rather, they lack institutions with long-held traditions, which can provide stability, peaceful transition of power, long-term economic planning for the benefit of the people. In religious terms, competing Catholicisms show that global Catholicism is rather a miracle. It's a miracle. At a time when most global institutions seem in crisis, the unity of the Catholic Church, its long-held traditions, all tested by history, are something to be praised and emulated for global religion and global politics. Roman Catholicism, I argue, is the clearest example of a global organization that works and is able to hold together different agendas carried on by different religious organizations, themselves backed by a variety of nations, cultures, and spirituality. It is a miracle, that's the point. Now, if you look at a debate between Hellenization of Christianity or Christianization of Hellenism, we have that debate in competing Catholicism at one point when we discuss the conflict the first president of Chad had with some missionaries during Chad's cultural revolution. The name of the president is Francois Tombalbaye. He proudly assumed that Christian identity, while promoting, Tombalbaye was a former deacon of the Baptist Church who became president and was now in conflict with other Protestant pastors. And while he assumed his Christian identity, he also promoted the return to Chad's traditional values. But he defined true Christianity as opposed to Christendom, imperialistic Christianity. To Tombalbaye, the West will keep its Hellenization of Christianity as part of the West approach to Christianity, which is, after all, an incarnate religion, and pushing back against Christendom, which is imperial Christianity. He wanted to try to go back to go through its own Hellenization without being imposed the Western Hellenization as part of imperial politics. To Tombalbaye, mission does not address justification as opposed to theosis. Instead, it addresses beliefs in evil spirit, for example, lack of material goods, education, health, etc. Mission focuses primarily on people's spiritual and material needs as the message to be proclaimed. And yet, as I argue in competing Catholicism, even that understanding of Christianity is still a kind of civilized mission. Thus, the importance of paying attention to what the first Cameroonian Jesuit did in the 1970s. These are big names in African Roman Catholicism. Ebusi Bulaga is one of them. Menrad Pierre Hebga is another, and Angel Bernveng, whose painting is the cover of the book, is the third one. I just want us to pay attention to the title of some of their works. In 1974, Ebousi wrote an article which title is Démission. There is a mistake here. Démission, which can be understood as resigning, démission, or demissionalization. Following Ebousi in 1976, Hebga wrote a book, Émancipation des Églises sous tutelle, the emancipation of, let's say, colonized churches, churches under trusteeship, colonized churches, in support of Ebousi démission. And 2 years later, in 1978, Beng wrote an article, De la soumission à la succession. And soumission, it can be underdeveloped mission. It can also be submission to succession. But these are the things they were raising in the 1970s, at a time when we had institutional changes in the church and in the Society of Jesus in French West Africa. Unfortunately, I say, they sounded like Henry Venn and Rufus Anderson, who are Protestants. I think this difference here is important, because like when African churches talk about inculturation today, they are actually focusing on the cultural aspect of Africanization, while these early Jesuits were actually discussing Africanizations in institutional terms, which can actually help us have serious conversations about, for example, the Africanization of canon law, for example. Now, where to go from here, from what I learned from this story? I think that Competing Catholicism is the first book ever written maybe by a Catholic priest with Catholicism in plural. And it is a good thing. It is a good thing. Why? Because when you analyze the historical aspect of the mission in Africa, the Vatican has its own agenda, but the Vatican do not have missionaries. They will go to French. And in French, it is a different story already. And when the French Jesuits will pick one of their provinces like Paris or Lyon and send them to Chad or Cameroon or Cote d'Ivoire, the history is not the same anymore. And when they arrive in Chad, they will meet a local church there or other religion, Christian communities there, who might be actually shaping the very agenda they came with. So at the end of the day, what we have in the mission still is different agenda within the same goal of evangelization. And these agendas are competing with each other. And competition in my book is therefore assumed as a fait accompli, something good, something good. So that's one point. The second thing is that competing Catholicism also departs from Catholic early missiology, the ones of Pierre Charles, for example, in the 1920s and 1930s. We all remember Charles' Robe Sans Couture, right? The book, Seamless Tunic, which was an excellent attempt to find shared theologies and practices among Catholics and Lutherans, as he proposed some sort of Catholic Lutheranism. That was in the 1930s. But what I'm trying to do here is, can we move beyond the seamless tunic? Yes, Christ has been undressed by the mocking soldiers. And seamless tunics are very common in mosques in Africa. It is not really the common dressing code in African churches. The majority of the faithful in Africa are women. Mamas, these Catholics are all mamas. They put on handmade clothes and hand-woven bands that can be sewed together to make a pain. The French concept of pain in Africa is very interesting because we have many pain actually in one piece. So the same dressing code is shared with the husband and children as means to consolidate the family bond. This is the image of a pain here. So this is the seamless robe, the seamless tunic here in the left, and this is the pain. You have different pieces, but in one dress code. And I think that's maybe where we are going. The third point is that the ecclesiology we describe the church as body of Christ seems to have been overcome by the Second Vatican's people of God. Yet, I argue, it will be a mistake to proceed by substitution as if one ecclesiology was completely canceling the other. The ecclesiology of the body of Christ solidifies the unity of the church of the people of God. For the body of Christ admits unity in diversity, as we see in 1 Corinthians 12, which is the lived reality of the people of God in Africa. During my first Mass, I had to pray in French, in Ewondo, in Latin, and even in English. And Latin, why? Because I learned the Paternoster from my grandmother, and it was for me a way to honor here. So when we have conversation about the Latin Mass in the West, as opposed to, I don't know which other Mass, for us in Africa, in some of our churches, it's not really a debate. We take whatever was good from the old and we move on in the new. The 4th point I am raising is that as much as one can still try to find the root cause of the rift among Christians and how irreversible that rift might have become, the lived and historical reality is that Catholics might never accept by decree Barrett's notion of schism and renewal. They will never willingly become Protestant or Eastern Orthodox for the simple sake of unity. Then what do we do? And I think it is something, it's a fait accompli. History has been very long and we have all kinds of deep interests that are already making that seamless Rob idea impossible. Can we just accept diversity and even competition and move forward in the only mission of God? The Catholic Church has historically been successful in keeping the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Pentecostals among its members, instead of trying to recover the seamless tunic of the past. Maybe ecumenism and being Catholic are not that far from the way forward. And that's my last point. On a methodological sense, competing Catholicism argues that before there was even any kind of translation, Lamin Sane, there was genuine human encounter and trust. You know, when a French missionary arrives in Mumbo, where I am right now, in 1940, he doesn't know the local language and the Chadians don't know French. How do they communicate? It is simply a human encounter before there is any translation. Christopher Brown singing the gospel, Stan Ilo narrativity, Dana Roberts focus on biography and friendship in mission. Maybe these are the methodological approach that we may have to pursue as we approach true dialogue. This picture, I just took it yesterday. It is a picture of Joseph Suleiman, who was 5 years old when the first missionary arrived in Baro. And this one is an Italian missionary, Martelloso, who is one of the last Jesuit missionaries in all of West Africa. These people are simply friends. This one knows the history of all the mission. And this one is, yes, as I said, the last missionary. So this picture can speak more to us, especially because Suleiman has a Muslim background. Again, as a conclusion, go back to the image. Everything is in the eyes. Our divisions maybe have to do more with the way we look at each other and the focus we have in each one's particular agenda and interests and historical wounds, while in fact, we are all working beneath the same cross carried by Christ, I mark within our own heart with his own image. That's all that I prepared. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Enyegu, and thank you for putting your message so concisely and yet such a very powerful message for us to hear. I'd like to ask the overall organizers, do we still have some time? Can we have 10 minutes for questions?
Well, I think yes.
Yes, okay.
5 minutes maybe.
Right. So please, either in Zoom, you can put your hand up or you can put a question in the chat, or we can take also questions from the floor to any of the speakers. I know that Professor Emma Wildwood needed to leave to give a lecture. Yes, so it will be to the other 4 speakers. Please, your questions.
Okay.
There is a question from the floor from Professor Papathanasiou, who may come here.
Yes.
I would like on my part to thank all speakers. I was really impressed. It was a brilliant, brand new material for me. We still need to rethink about it, but I'll leave the microphone to Professor Papathanasiou. Thank you.
I'd like to express, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to all the speakers. As a matter of fact, I have many questions, but I'll try to pose only two of them. The first is addressed to Professor Wildwood, but it also pertains to Father Jean-Luc and Sister Mary. I'm doing some research on the expansion of the prosperity gospel, on the prosperity gospel movements, which, in my opinion, articulate not a diverse reading of the gospel, but an anti-gospel. Anyhow, the question is, what is the depth of the influence, the impact of the prosperity gospel movements on the African society at large, and especially on the so-called mainstream church bodies? I mean, is there a tension? Is there a conflict between the mainstream churches and the prosperity gospel movements, or perhaps a kind of penetration of prosperity gospel movements or mindset into the mainstream congregations? And the second question is, has to do with the increase of Christianity in Africa. For the time being, this increase is due primarily to conversions or perhaps to the birth rates. I mean, the proliferation of Christian families, perhaps. Many thanks.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Professor Papathanasiou. I can only see Professor Enyego and Professor Mumbo. Would you like to respond to those questions?
Okay. Thank you for that, for the wonderful question. What I can say is that history is interesting because history reminds us of the immensity of Africa in terms of as a continent, the diversity of cultures and subcultures and context, which makes that I mean, the prosperity gospel, you have to look at it locally, how it is being addressed locally. In some contexts, we really have a serious conflict between it and mainland churches, especially because mainland churches will be criticizing that approach to Christianity that actually ignores the cross and the suffering reality of the faithful. In other contexts, it is actually inspiring and penetrating. I saw one man in a village in Cameroon who was Catholic before, and but he called himself a drunkard, and then he met one of these prosperity gospel pastors who touched his heart, and the guy stopped drinking, started building a small business, and was very good and useful to the community, but he never stopped being Catholic. So that's, you have that kind of micro realities as well. In terms of demographic shift, I think that yes, there is a demographic boom in terms of birth rates, but at the same time, you also have Christianity growing in some areas, including in some previously Muslim-dominated territories. Like if you go to northern Cameroon today, we have like around 6 Catholic dioceses in a region that was supposedly Muslim-dominated. But at the same time, if you are in Mumbo, where I am right now, of a population of 8,000 people, you only have around 400
Yes. There seems to be a small connection problem, but it's okay.
Yes. Perhaps whilst we're waiting for the connection, Professor Mumbo or Sister Mary Joan, would you like to respond to the questions?
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think when it comes to the prosperity gospel, it is complex in terms of the way it is propagated and the way it is taken on by people. There's a sense in which one can say that it capitalizes on the poverty and the harsh realities of the people. But you also cannot deny that there's a way in which it attracts people because of the context. And then secondly, when we talk about the growth of Christianity, it's also another complex. First of all, you can ask who is counting, how are they counting, and what is the purpose of counting, because the statistics can be also very ideological. The truth is, yes, there is population growth of people that one can say, yes, the numbers are growing. There is also something to say they are growing where there's also a space where you can say people are moving from one group to another. So how do you do the counting? So there's the politics of counting. But in many places, it seems to be the only thing that people can belong to, and so they belong. It is the only thing that is a social space for people to gather to share their challenges and difficulties. So yeah, it is attracting many, many people, despite the urbanization, the secularization that we also see, that people still look for spiritual spaces for consolation, that people haven't denied their spiritual aspects. So they are too complex. We want to know what your research brings out, but they are very complex. There is truth in it, and there is not falsehood, but there is also questions in it. Rather than either or, one could see as both and in terms of the reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mumbo. Are there other questions? Or I don't know whether Professor Eniego has come back online to us.
Yes, I think we're pretty much close to the end of this session.
Yes.
Dr. Alison Kolosova, thank you so much for presiding over our second roundtable. And yes, please.
Yes, can I just say very much thank you to all the speakers. This has been such a rich session. I think we could have had a whole conference just based on this session and all the issues and material that the speakers have presented us with. I think we've all learned so much, and I'm just glad that throughout the other sessions of the day, I hope that some of the issues you have raised will come up again, and that we can continue to discuss them throughout the day. So thank you very much to all of you. Evie, would you like to say anything finally? Do you have any?
Yes, something practical? No,
announcements?
I'm not going to add more material to the exquisite material we already received. It's just time for a break. We have a small coffee break here too. And for all people afar, we should start at 12:40 sharp, so that you also know we need this break. And I'm sure that through publication of the minutes of the conference and through other means, we will keep on this discussion that has just started. I also would like to thank all the speakers for their insightful presentations, and you, Alison, for your sharing. Thank you.
Many thanks to all. As we have just heard, in 20 minutes, approximately 20 minutes from now, all back in our positions for the very interesting part that is forthcoming. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ όλες και όλους. Σε 20 περίπου λεπτά θα ξεκινήσουμε εκ νέου με την τρίτη στρογγυλή τράπεζα στην τρίτη συνεδρία του Διεθνούς Συνεδρίου Ηχοτοπία της Αφρικής, Θεολογικές, Ανθρωπολογικές και Δικαιϊκές Προσεγγίσεις. Όσες και όσοι δεν έχουν γράψει τα στοιχεία τους στο chat και επιθυμούν βεβαίως παρακολούθησης μπορούν να το πράξουν τώρα. Είναι μια ευκαιρία. Όσοι μας παρακολουθείτε διαζώσεις και από κοντά, μπορείτε βέβαια να αφήσετε τα στοιχεία σας στη γραμματεία που είναι πλησίον της κεντρικής θύρας, από έξω, στην είσοδο. Θα διακόψουμε λοιπόν τώρα για 20 λεπτά περίπου, θα κλείσουμε το σύνδεσμο και μετά συνδεόμαστε όλοι, όλες και όλοι, στον ίδιο σύνδεσμο ακριβώς με την ίδια διαδικασία που κάναμε και τώρα. Είναι η ίδια διαδικασία, same procedure, same connection for all to go into the next chapter, the third chapter of our higher apostolical, of our mission saga today, academic saga. Thank you very much.